For more on the latest developments in Zimbabwe, we are now joined from our Pretoria studio by political analyst Dr. Mpofu. Dr. Mpofu, good evening and thank you so much for joining us on The Globe. Now, just about every report coming out of Zimbabwe paints a very bleak picture about the economy, politics and the social well-being of Zimbabweans. Now, this is quite a huge contrast to that period of hope that followed the takeover of President Mnangagwa. Now, former President Mugabe, about 14 months ago, what has gone wrong?
I think what the world and what Africa and what Zimbabweans are witnessing right now in Zimbabwe is the return of colonialism by another name and by other people. There's a way in which those people that fought colonialism, such fighters like Robert Mugabe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, and one Constantine Chiwenga, and others as a collective, fought colonialism not to replace it with liberation, but to reproduce it and bring it back. Now fronted by black bodies, fronted by locals, fronted by black people on other black people. So what is happening in Zimbabwe is actually an African colonial, post-colonial, and neo-colonial problem, in that we are witnessing scenes of torture, rape, violation of people, violence, arson, and other forms of diabolic exploitation, oppression, and domination of one by another. And this conducted by what is supposed to be a liberation movement and a liberation government in a country. So there's a way in which those who fought colonialism reproduced and brought back another form of colonialism in a country. And it's an African, an international and a human crisis that needs urgent attention. And the players that are involved in this, the politicians, the soldiers, cannot help themselves, but there is need for Africa and the world to gang up and bring this inhuman, diabolic and atrocious persecution of human beings to an end.
Now, Doc, it would appear that the presidential election last year has failed to legitimize President Mnangagwa's rule. Now, given the number of protests that we've seen springing up in Zimbabwe, what's your take on this?
There is a way in which the promises, the gestures, and the mantra of Zimbabwe is open for business that Emmerson Mnangagwa has been flagging and circulating around the world, are increasingly appearing to be what they exactly are, which is a myth, a fiction, and a falsehood. So things are falling apart faster than what even the skeptics expected. The rhetoric is not holding, the promises are not holding. Clearly, even the allies that this post-coup junta had are also pulling back. Zimbabwe is sinking into more and more and more what can be called a pariah state. And Zimbabweans, especially the leading junta itself, can no longer help themselves out of this. The world has to intervene. As I speak to you now, women are being raped, homes are being burnt, children are suffering, law is not working, the polity has collapsed after the economy itself has decayed. So Zimbabwe and its purported leaders needs to be helped out of this, because the crisis of legitimacy, the crisis of credibility, and the crisis of confidence has degenerated to levels that have become genocidal. Because when they shut down the social media, they shut down the internet, what happens behind the curtains that have been created is diabolic, is genocidal, is inhuman, and it's unacceptable in 2019 that you get mass atrocities, rapes, starvings, torture of human beings by others. Is not acceptable, and Africa has to suspend pretenses to liberation war solidarities, brotherhood and sisterhood, and address a primitive, inhuman development that is taking place.
Now, Dr. Mpofu, what are the solutions to the major crisis that is being seen in Zimbabwe currently?
What is needed is human solidarity. South Africa and other neighbouring African countries should wake up to the fact that what was supposed to be a dream of liberation in Zimbabwe has turned into a nightmare, and that worse political, social and other conditions than colonialism are taking place and are ensuing in Zimbabwe. And let Africa suspend partisan solidarities and address a humanitarian crisis whereby women are being raped in broad daylight by security forces. What was supposed to be a national defense force has been turned into a national attack force, and atrocities are taking place as if they are common sense, as if they are normal, as if they are natural. So I think human interest should go ahead of whatever solidarities and whatever alliances are there amongst and between African countries to say, let us stop this. Emerson Mnangagwa fought colonialism, just like Robert Mugabe fought colonialism, just like Constantine Chiwenga fought colonialism. But in no time, these individuals, as black as they are, as African as they are, they have brought another form of colonialism. In the darkness, outside the view of the media and outside the view of the world, human beings are being tortured, human beings are being killed, human beings are being raped. And that should be unacceptable, unless if Africa is prepared to prove the same stereotypes that colonialism created, that blacks are incapable of governing each other, are incapable of liberating themselves, and are incapable of running countries and running states. So what is happening in Zimbabwe is another colonialism by another name and conducted by the victims of colonialism and people that fought colonialism. And this is an emergency.
Now,
unless
has
you want to see
SADC,
another Rwanda 1994.
Dr. Mpofu, has SADC as a regional body perhaps missed an opportunity to engage differently with Zimbabwe once the new leadership of President Mnangagwa took over?
The first mistake was to treat a coup as a non-coup. The overthrow of Robert Mugabe, as diabolic, as dictatorial, as tyrannical as he was, and as genocidal as he was conducted through a coup. But because so many people were dying for the removal of Robert Mugabe, they so euphorically accepted a coup as a non-coup. And in the height and the wave of that coup and that euphoria, people were willing to ignore the injustice of it all and say, this must be liberation. But no one expected that this was an enhancement, a reinvigoration of tyranny rather than an overthrow of it. So Zimbabweans, Africa and the world made a mistake in ever celebrating a coup. But now, I think everyone should have realized that a mistake was made. People must wake up and address this nightmare, because worse than what colonialism did and worse than what Robert Mugabe did is taking place in Zimbabwe as we speak.
Now, Dr.
And
Mpofu, we
the
have run out of time, but very quickly, just in wrapping up, the assistance that the government of Cyril Ramaphosa looks to be wanting to give to Zimbabwe, it looks increasingly difficult to justify intervening in Zimbabwe when the challenges that we're facing as a state here in South Africa are looking very staggering on the one part. And on the other part, the DA's call to approach the United Nations Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court to seek intervention on the human rights crisis in Zimbabwe. Two-part question, very quickly, just in wrapping up. What's your take on both these issues?
All the liberation movements in Africa should look themselves in the eye. The ANC that Cyril Ramaphosa presides over right now is the oldest liberation movement in Africa. It's time to look at brothers and sisters in the eye and say, never again should Africa be the laughing stock of the world. And let's stop pampering each other and playing with each other. Brothers and sisters, let's stand up to ourselves so that we don't remain the same colonial subjects and the same laughing stocks of the world that we were. Let's not enhance stereotypes of the racists, of the colonialists, and of the dominators that we had. And let's give tough love to each other and address the question of democracy, the question of human rights, and the question of being in Africa as African.
Dr. Mpofu, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for now. That was Dr. William Mpofu, a political analyst, and he was coming to us live from our Pretoria studios. Now, still on Zimbabwe.